Brilliant today. We are going to do our best to make it even more brilliant because we've got the best conversation this side of the Niger. Now, let's talk about the AfCFTA agreement. Let's talk about that. Well, of course, we're trying to get in touch with our guest. He's still not here with us, unfortunately, but we're doing our best to get in touch with him over Skype because today's conversation is going to be a doozy, if I do say so myself. But yes, what should you know about the AfCFTA? Is Nigeria ready? What should you know about the AfCFTA and is Nigeria ready? AfCFTA is, of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been on pause for most of the year because of COVID 19. But now, African governments say that they are ready for the agreement to go into effect on New Year's Day 2021. They are ready, they say, for this to go into effect on New Year's Day 2021. And that brings me to our big hard fact for today. Africa's GDP is 2.6 trillion naira, while Nigeria's GDP is $397 billion. So that means Africa's economy is 6.5 times bigger than Nigeria's own. So the hope is if Nigeria and Nigerian businesses will certainly have a market that is almost 7 times bigger than what they have access to locally, it will be through this. And that's the reason why a lot of people are excited about the AfCFTA, but other people are worried. They wonder what will happen when suddenly businesses from other African countries can suddenly compete in the Nigerian market on equal footing with Nigerian businesses. So these are the types of issues that we want to talk about today. We're going to look at what the AfCFTA is all about, what it means for Nigerians in our day-to-day lives. We're also going to talk about how prepared or unprepared for this agreement, we are. And here to talk about it with me is the editor-in-chief at Steers Business. We brought in one of the biggest fishes in the country on the show today. His name is Tokunbo Afikuyomi. Tokunbo, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Sandra. Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Lagos, while we're having this conversation, sending your messages about the AfCFTA, sending your questions about the AfCFTA. It's a great opportunity to get real answers. He's an economist. He's the editor-in-chief of a fantastic business publication. Do you think Africa is ready? Do you think Nigeria is ready? Let's start with the very basics, Tokumbo. What is a free trade agreement?
Okay, so I guess from the jump, a free trade agreement is when a collection of countries, sometimes it's bilateral, just two countries, sometimes it can be an area where it involves a region of countries. And essentially what they are saying to each other is, we want to strengthen how much we trade our goods and services with you. And so they sign a few documents, a few legal documents that then allows them to start to trade on preferential terms. So for example, they give each other preferential access to each other's economy. So, for example, in Africa, for the Africa agreement, for example, what they're saying is, even though other countries have to pay, 10% tariffs to bring in because you're in the African Union, I'm going to give you a preferred access.
Right.
You pay 0% tariff, for example. So that's basically what a trade agreement is. You're saying you want to give a particular country preferential access to your economy.
How do the conditions of trade in a free trade agreement differ from the default conditions when there is no free trade agreement?
So the default is what almost all countries in the world by default trade under the WTO. So there's a World Trade Organization essential agreement where most countries are currently trading under. And under those conditions, I guess the restrictions between countries is still quite high. So you still have very high barriers, very high tariffs, even non-tariffs. So non-tariff barriers are things like qualifications that people need to work in different countries or visa restrictions. All these other blockers are called non-tariff barriers. They're still barriers, but they aren't like a monetary tax. But on the default, those barriers are still quite high between different countries. And they were signed under the WTO. And under that condition, any any high barrier you have with one country, you have it with all other countries as well. So when someone wants to have preferential access, that's when they say, okay, let's skip over this WTO deal and let's have our own special arrangement where you can give me that extra access to your economy.
So initially, the Nigerian government was at the forefront of developing the idea of an African free trade area. But when the AfCFTA was finally drafted, we initially refused to sign. What made us get jittery? Do you know, Chokumbo?
Yeah, so the thing with trade is that there are always winners and losers with trade. So you said it quite correctly when at the beginning of the show. So when you open up your economy to another country, so let's use the Africa agreements, for example. The way I described it to my newsroom is that you basically have, so 54 countries are currently signed. What you have is you now have 54 agricultural sectors, you have 54 financial sectors, you have 54 all these sectors are basically 54 versions of the same sector. If you think of the Africa Agreement as basically trying to create one country, which is kind of what the African Union is trying to head towards. At the end of the day, they want to look like the EU, where even the currencies are the same. So basically, you're creating a big block of countries where there are 54 versions of the same sectors. And what happens is that consumers and businesses will decide which of those 54 variants they want. So, for example, Nigerians will say, you know what, I don't want to eat Nigerian agriculture anymore. I want to eat agriculture from Kenya. That's what I want to consume. And so the whole of Africa can decide, you know what, let's just use only Kenya for our food, and we'll use Nigeria for something else.
Right.
And so what then happens is Nigeria's agriculture sector suffers because everyone is pushing towards another agriculture sector. And so this thing I just described happens with every single sector in the economy. They're going to fight, each sector will fight with each other, and there'll be a winner and there'll be a loser. So in Nigeria's case, one of the major reasons why we didn't want to sign was because one of the major winners of this deal is going to be high-skilled manufacturing. So energy-intensive high-skilled manufacturing. And one of the losers is going to be low-skilled manufacturing as a whole on the Africa Agreement. And so the manufacturing union in Nigeria was very upset about that. And so they were very vocal, and they were lobbying with the current administration to see what they can do to reduce that impact. And so that was one of the major reasons why Nigeria was a bit jittery about signing the agreement.
What do you think about the fear expressed by some government officials that under the agreement, Nigeria will get swamped by exports from Africa and China, and our local businesses will suffer?
From where in China, sorry?
From other African countries. So they're worried that Nigeria will get swamped by exports from other African countries and China.
Yeah.
And that will make our local businesses suffer.
Yes. So according to the World Bank, the World Bank has done some estimations of what they think would happen when the agreement comes into force from next year.
Right.
And according to that, it looks like one of the major winners is going to be almost every other country apart from Nigeria. So the thing, if you think about it from a tariff basis, so Nigeria currently has one of the highest tariffs in terms of what other African countries face. So basically, on average, other African countries face an import tariff to Nigeria of around 14%. Whereas for other countries like South Africa, it's like 1%. So basically, when this new trade agreement reduces everything to zero, the benefit is for people who are trying to get stuff into Nigeria, who used to face 14%,
right,
but are now facing 0%. That's a very big gain for people who are outside trying to, sell. What that means is that there's an expectation that there will be a flood of exports, coming into the country. So that's on the African side. That all said, it's not going to be in a region or a magnitude that's going to be substantial. It's not going to be that instrumental. So I think according to the World Bank, our intra-Africa imports will go from something like 4% to 9% of our total trade. So at the end, we're still not going to import that much from Africa. Now,
okay, go on.
The China point. Sorry, just very quickly. The China point is interesting. So the fear there is that because if you think about the Africa Trade Agreement, you're basically trying to create one country where you can move goods between different countries without stress. It's almost like trying to move something from Lagos to Kaduna or Lagos to Abuja. They want it to almost be that simple. No need for border checks and customs and all that. That's
Kind
what
of
the
like
trade.
what they had in the EU before
Yes,
Brexit.
exactly, exactly. That's what they're trying to. That's what this African Free Trade Agreement is supposed to try and do. The problem with that is there are many African countries, and including Nigeria, where the security at the borders is not that tight. So you can have a situation where China finds a weak spot, or any country finds a weak spot in Africa in terms of getting goods into the continent. And once that good arrives in the weak spot state, it can now travel across the continent almost freely, if you see what I mean. So that is one of the fears, that if we don't properly protect only made in Africa goods to have that free movement,
Right.
then you can have a situation where there is one particular weak country or a few weak countries that let Chinese or other, third-party country goods into the continent, and that good is allowed to freely flow to the country through the continent rather. And just very quickly, they're trying one way they usually try and stop this is through this thing called rules of origin, where they make sure that any good that is giving that free access has a high percentage of made in Africa inside of that good.
What do you think about the people who say that the idea should be for Nigeria to find areas where it has superior products and services and flood their markets? Also, I mean, if superior and cheaper products and services enter Nigeria, they could lead to a reduced cost of living here, which is also a benefit. What do you think about that argument?
Yes, I mean it's very correct. So I mean unfortunately, the way most people think about trade is from an export orientation. So people, tend to believe that exports are a good thing and imports are a bad thing. So especially in Nigeria, where we have an administration that is very anti-imports. But the thing is, imports are very, very crucial for an economy. In fact, you need imports to export. For a lot of countries, even China, for example.
Right.
Let's take something like the iPhone. So, the iPhone is made and manufactured in China and is exported across the world. But to do that, China has to import American intellectual property to do that. Without Apple's research and development that's imported into China, China would not be able to export the iPhone. So imports are very important for, number one, exports, and then two, for consumers, because what imports do provide is, as I mentioned, when you have 54 variants of a particular sector, consumers will pick the one that best works for them. So they have more variety, one, and two, cheaper. They can have a cheaper option. And that boosts the welfare of consumers in any country.
Right.
And so that is a benefit to consumers. The ability to import goods is a benefit to consumers. And that's an argument that is a lot of times not given the light of day.
If you just joined the show, you're listening to Hard Facts on 99.3 Nigeria Info. What should you know about the AfCFTA? Is Nigeria ready? Helping us with that is the editor-in-chief at Stairs Business. They are a digital business publication. You should check them out. In fact, check them out right now. stairsbusiness.com, I think. Is it .com or .ng?
So it's stairsng.com.
Stairsng.com, right. So check them out and see a lot of the good work that they're doing there. And we have the editor-in-chief on the show today. And he's talking to us about, we've started with the very basics. We've started with what a free trade agreement is, what the conditions of a free trade agreement are, what the conditions are for a free trade agreement, how they differ from a no free trade agreement. We've also talked about the Nigerian government being at the forefront of developing an idea for a free trade agreement, and we talked about why we suddenly got jittery. Some people, by the way, say, Tokumbo, that a change of government caused that. They seem to think it was the Jonathan administration that pioneered AfCFTA, but this administration wasn't too keen on it because, like we've talked about, this administration is worried that a free trade agreement would lead to other African countries flooding Nigeria's markets. But anyways, we've also talked, Tokumbo and I, we've also talked about the fear expressed by some government officials that under the agreement, Nigeria will get swamped by exports from Africa and China, and our local businesses will suffer. So that's where we're at before you join the show. But then again, Tokumbo,
Hmm.
we changed our mind again and finally agreed to sign. What caused that second change of heart?
Yeah, so I think it was always going to be signed eventually.
Hmm.
There's just a bit of, so the thing about trade agreements is they are as political as they are about economics. So the game of trying to, I mean, people would have seen the way Trump has behaved in terms of his trade war with China, but there's always this threat that bigger countries tend to have in order to get what they want. And in Nigeria's case, being I guess the largest economy in Africa,
Right.
it was just one of those ways that we were trying to show our strength in that we will not accept anything that we do not want to have on the table. And so that was kind of us just saying, okay, we're going to take our time. We're going to decide what we want, if we want to accept it or not. But at the end of the day, based on the amount of work that's gone into it over the years,
Right.
at least the technocrats that have been working on it, were already of the view that eventually it was going to be signed.
Right.
It was just, like you said, the change in government brought in extra questions that also
Mm-hmm.
had to be answered.
Mm-hmm.
And as that process was going through, that was what caused the delays.
Mm.
And then eventually, they found that they were okay to kick off.
You also have people who argue that the government was advised that if the AfCFTA happens without us, we would lose out because the rest of Africa would essentially become a single economy, which would now draw off ours. What do you think about that argument?
Yes, it's very true. So you're basically going to be neighbors to one of the largest trading, the largest trading area in the world. And what that would mean is, say I'm Volkswagen or I'm, any other manufacturing company. I have
Mm.
two options. I build my factory in Nigeria with 200 million people, or do I do Africa?
Mm.
So that option is almost a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with that is you can choose anywhere in Africa to build that manufacturing company.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do Ghana. If you do Ghana, you still have access to the rest of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So that would just have made Nigeria's prospects as an investment
Destination.
destination even weaker.
Did Nigeria lose anything from our initial hesitation to sign the agreement, do you think?
Um, in terms of the economics, no. I think it was probably more the investment climate, the investment environment, more just this lack of faith in Nigeria's ability to basically have a consistent policy.
Right.
Where Nigeria is known for always wavering left and right. A new ban comes in, within seconds. It's like the government wakes up one morning and then they decide to ban something or change a particular policy. So I think most of the impact would have come from investors just not being certain about what Nigeria wants to do or what Nigerian government is thinking. And that has been said to have a very, very big impact on how much money actually comes in. So, the government is crazy about getting as much dollars as possible into the country, but the way in which we do this policy making that isn't quite clear is a very, very big deterrent to an investor. I mean, if you have billions of dollars, right, you're not gonna throw it somewhere where you can't predict what the government is going to do next morning. So even thinking about where you're gonna build your factory in Africa, Ghana versus Nigeria, you're sure Ghana is gonna sign it. You're not sure if Nigeria is gonna sign it. Potentially, they might have been people who have already made the decision to go elsewhere during that time, but it would be very hard to quantify.
Someone wants to know how the trade agreement will affect Nigeria's product certification organizations. So, example, NAFDAC, in terms of ensuring that the other countries' products coming into Nigeria are safe for our use.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a lot of work for them. There's going to have to be a lot of coordination between NAFDAC and their counterparts in other African countries, because for this trade agreement to work, we basically have to all agree on basically our regulating standards. So we all have to agree, this is how we want to label our biscuits. This is the process for getting a medicine approved. Because this is exactly what the EU has had to do for the entire bloc. And that's what allows you to be able to move goods freely. If you don't have that, then you can't. So, for example, I wrote an article about this last week where there was an instance where Zimbabwe was trying to get something called sweet biscuits into South Africa, but the trucks got stopped at the border because the labeling was not of the correct standards to South Africa. So those kind of issues can't continue to happen if this trade agreement is to work properly. So NAFDAC has to do a lot of coordination with its other counterparts to have an Africa-wide, agreement on how our food and other important goods like medicine should work in terms of quality, which is a very hard feat. I don't see that happening anytime soon. That's something that we're going to have to wait quite a while to get to.
Now, whenever we talk about trade agreements, we have to talk about competitive advantage, right? The hope is that there are products and services that Nigeria produces more efficiently, and so we can sell those to the rest of Africa. Do you think we have any competitive advantages when it comes to the AfCFTA, Tokumbo?
Well, I think there are some sectors, even within agriculture, that potentially Nigeria could do well in, and also services. I think Nigeria can take a good position in terms of the services that it sells. So stuff like accounting, legal. I'm sure people in countries like slightly less developed, say like a Mali, might have access to like a Nigerian lawyer, and that might be beneficial to both parties. So I think professional services could be one. Definitely communications and technology as well. Nigeria could do well, especially in, I guess, our region. Less so when you go to East Africa and South Africa. There you have the competition is a bit more fierce. But I think more on the services side, there are things. Manufacturing will be a struggle for Nigeria, which is why, like I mentioned earlier, the Manufacturing Association is not keen on signing this agreement. In fact, according to the World Bank, I think it's Congo that actually does very well manufacturing wise. Definitely a lot better than Nigeria. I'm not sure about that story. I haven't actually looked into Congo's manufacturing before, but that's just already things that we're seeing from preliminary results.
So, you're talking about aspects of, for instance, the knowledge economy. You've got software development and related fields being huge in places like Lagos, for instance. Lagos has a huge startup ecosystem. You've got our tech companies who could compete in the rest of Africa on an equal footing. Maybe banking too. I don't know. The entertainment sector. What do you think?
Definitely entertainment. We all know, especially how well Nigerian music and film travels outside of the borders, even especially in Africa as well. On the tech side, Kenya and South Africa are also quite strong there.
Yeah.
So it's going to be some, I guess, there might be some
competition.
On that part. In terms of what was that sector did we mention? Tech.
The startup ecosystem.
Oh, you mentioned banks. Sorry.
Banking as well.
South African banks are very strong.
Okay.
They are definitely the leaders on the continent.
Okay.
But Nigeria was seeing some Nigerian banks starting to also start to get a footing on banking Africa-wide. Banks like UBA and the like. So, and Access Bank has also been making a few moves. So that could also be another sector where we could see some gains.
Unless, of course, you've got people protesting and then accounts have to get frozen.
Right, yes, no, that can't work.
If you just joined the show, you're listening to Hard Facts on 99.3 Nigeria Info. What should you know about the AfCFTA? Do you think Nigeria is ready? AfCFTA is, of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been on pause for most of the year because of COVID-19, but now African governments say that they are ready for the agreement to go into effect on the New Year's Day of 2021. Inshallah, we all make it to 2021 because I feel like 2020 is not done with us yet. But hey, here's our big hard fact for today. Africa's GDP is $2.6 trillion, while Nigeria's GDP is $397 billion. So that means that Africa's economy is 6.5 times bigger than Nigeria's own. So the hope is if Nigerian businesses will suddenly have a market that is almost 7 times bigger than what they have access to locally, that could be a great thing. That's the reason why a lot of people are excited about the AfCFTA. We're going to talk more about the AfCFTA after this short break. I'm Sandra Ezekwesili.
More news and information coming up. We'll be back in a moment.
A place where you can win without limits. A place where you get a 100% bonus to stake. A place where virtual is brought to reality. Even more. A place where you can bet online anytime, even while you're out of data. Register on actionbet.ng. ActionBet. Think bold. Take action. Win big.
Every day, someone stands a chance to be a winner.
Really?
Yes. 50,000 naira every week on Just a Minute Game Show. Just call in to any of our shows. The Morning Crossfire, What's Up Lagos, The Sunny Side, and Hard Facts. Answer as many questions as possible within 60 seconds and we'll be giving out 50,000 naira every week. Yes! Winners will be announced on Hard Facts with Sandra Ezekwesili. Just a Minute, the game show for everyone on your number one station for talk. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.
Mama Mina won't send money, make Amina collect for school. Obina won't withdraw from your account, but you no carry in card. Hey, waiting them go use. Na Momo, them go use. Na Momo agents, them go use you. Sisi Ronke won't pay light bill, plus Richard Go TV. Nishi for no go Miss Telemundo. Tamuna say she won't buy data for phone. Waiting them go use. Na Momo, them go use.
Share your hotspots.
a free trade agreement, out. That was not the priority at the time. Also, because of lockdowns, I mean, sometimes it's hard to imagine, but all these policies that we see on the news are actually just created by people going back and forth and talking to individuals, drafting papers, and that involves a lot of logistics. So people actually physically couldn't continue to visit, have meetings physically to continue the negotiations and all of that. I mean, eventually virtual meetings came into play, but that was not an immediate response to the pandemic. And then, of course, the actual enforcement of the free trade agreement in terms of, signing the laws and then, getting all the necessary equipment at the borders to carry out the actual agreement, that was also delayed because of the different, border closures that had to happen. It was in an attempt to kind of slow down the spread of the virus. So, I mean, as people have said, you can't really have a free trade agreement if your borders are shut.
It's a good time to bring up the borders, by the way. Right now, Nigeria's land borders are closed. We're restricting imports from other African countries because the government is concerned that ECOWAS nations are gaming the ECOWAS treaty to flood Nigeria with imports from other regions of the world. The government is also saying that they may keep the border closed even after the AfCFTA comes into effect. Is there not a contradiction or a paradox for a country in a free trade area to close its borders? I don't know. I'm not saying nothing, but would this not mean that Nigeria is in violation of the AfCFTA?
I mean, so I think there's a famous bio on Twitter now that goes, anything you see in Nigeria, you take it back. And this is one of those cases, right? I mean, okay, the border closure situation. Okay, I think let's actually start. There are grounds for Nigeria's problem or current fight with people like Benin. I've been to Benin many times, and the way we have petrol stations in Nigeria,
right,
it is not the case there. Most of the petrol that you buy there is basically the same way we buy stuff at the Malam. Like, they have many stalls that just sell illegal petrol from Nigeria. That is essentially how most people get petrol in Benin. It's slowly getting better, but since I used to go there back in like 2006 up last year, most of the petrol sold in that country at least is illegal petrol in Nigeria. They have basically set up their economy from the ground up to basically feed off of Nigeria. And that has been bread and butter for decades now. And they even the way their warehouses are structured and their positioning right next to the same border, it is all for just carrying illegal or legal goods from Nigeria to sell at a higher price in Benin. So there's also the issue of security, of actually securing the border. So even now that we say the border is closed, if you go there now, it's like there are people, there's movement. Like goods and services, goods are still moving across. And it is just because it is extremely difficult to actually police the border between, in fact, many African countries. I mean, it was, some Europeans, drew some lines and said, okay, this is one country, this is another country. What has effectively happened is, if you look at the border between Ogun State and Benin Republic, or even Lagos and Benin Republic, it is extremely hard to police. Some parts are in mountains, some parts are in the water. It's not actually possible to completely police that border. So it has been very difficult for Nigeria to actually figure out ways to stop this illegal smuggling. Smuggling through semi border is standard. You are better, in fact, if you want to get through the border, you are better off being a smuggler trying to bribe someone to get through than you trying to go through the correct route. You will spend more time there. So there's actually a problem, first of all, in terms of the border situation and with Nigeria and its neighboring countries. And that's why Nigeria, went all the way to say, you know what, if you guys are not going to try and help us solve this problem, we're going to close the border altogether. It even comes down to little things like, we don't know how much petrol we actually consume as a nation, because a lot of it that is supposedly Nigerian is actually just being taken to other countries. So there is an issue there, and some of it is possible to deal with, and some of it is actually not, just because of how difficult it is geographically to police our borders. So that issue is always there. And as you said, the free trade agreement is not going to just all of a sudden solve
that problem.
this. Yes, and Nigeria's, and the other neighboring countries, like the battle or the fight between us is not going to be solved just because we've signed a free trade agreement. If Nigeria is not satisfied with the others in terms of adhering to their demands, then the borders will probably remain shut regardless of agreement. So it will just be contradiction, paradox, etc., and we'll continue as we are even on the 1st of January if Nigeria is not satisfied.
What could be the consequences of such a violation?
Well, according to in the free trade agreement, what it also does is it gives countries powers to basically set up disputes. So another African country can basically say, to the African Union or any body that's created, or any committee that's created for the free trade agreement, basically a dispute to Nigeria that Nigeria is not adhering to the rules that it has signed under the free trade agreement.
Right.
And there will be, they will go through a process, and at the end of the day, it's possible that Nigeria could receive some sort of penalty for that. Now, I haven't seen the detail in terms of what would be allowed to be done, but it's something. What usually happens is, what we've been seeing with China and the US, increasing tariffs. That's usually the go-to punishment. So if a country feels that Nigeria is not adhering to the free trade agreement laws, through the right channels, it can be agreed that that country can now set very high tariffs on Nigerian goods, and so Nigerian businesses will suffer for that. Before that actually happens, will take a while, but that would be a potential consequence. But even indirectly, again, it goes back to that thing I was saying about what investors think about Nigeria and its ability to actually do what it says, and have consistent policy. So that means we would have gone from Nigeria wants the agreement to it doesn't want it anymore, to now it wants it, and then border closure actually doesn't want it anymore. So that inconsistency just throws for foreign investors off. And so that's another indirect impact that Nigeria will suffer from if we are still in a place where our borders are closed to other, land, neighboring countries in Africa, yet we have a free trade agreement with them.
I have a question here from Richie, who wants to know if the AfCFTA can sue Nigeria for not opening their borders with Benin, Togo, Ghana, etc., as the case may be for transportation. If all these countries are parties involved in the agreement come January, he also wants to know. Well, I guess you just answered that question. What the penalties are, and how they'll affect the government.
Yeah, so like I said, it won't actually be able to sue. Not necessarily a lawsuit per se, but it would just most likely would be a situation where they will be allowed to retaliate in some way that should potentially harm Nigeria. I guess the thing for Nigeria is because of how big we are, there is very little room for a country like Benin Republic to say, okay, we're going to punish you by setting high tariffs on any goods that come into our country.
Right.
Yes, there'll be particular businesses that will suffer from that, but as a whole, Nigeria will see that as quite a small threat and not really care much about such a threat. So that's one way in which there can be punishment, but depending on the country, it might not be enough of a punishment for the Nigerian government to actually do anything about it.
Okay. If you just joined the show, Lagos, you're listening to Hard Facts on 99.3 Nigeria Info. I'm Sandra Ezekwesili. What should you know about the AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? Do you think Nigeria is ready? Answering that question is Tokumbo Afikuyomi, who is the editor-in-chief at Stairs Business. You can find them at stairs.ng, where they have a lot of fantastic business-related news stories, articles, breaking down the business environment of Nigeria, and they talk about all kinds of things. So you should check them out. But hey, you've been listening to the conversation. If you have, I wonder what your thoughts are on the points that Tokumbo has made. What do you think about the answers you've heard about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and area? Has your opinion changed? Do you think it's a good idea? In what areas do you think Nigeria can benefit? What do you think our competitive advantages are? Now, Tokumbo talked about the service industry. I talked about the knowledge industry. We talked a bit about banking. We talked about the entertainment industry. Do you think that there are others that we're leaving out? 0700 993 993 0700 993 993 993. Yes, please. You can send in your thoughts via WhatsApp. WhatsApp is 080 959 75805. 080 959 75805. Ebuka is in Mushin. Hello, Ebuka. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, Auntie Sandra, how you yourself?
Hi, Dick. Okay, how you doing?
I did alright. So, okay, your guest. Good evening. So, wait to me, I be one talk. How is our security like? Because all these goods will be coming from border. I think our military guys, because I think they are the ones over there. And also, NAFDAC, body that regulates, let's say, SON and so many other body that regulate whatever coming into the country. I think they should up and doing so that Nigeria will not just be dumping grants. Because, Andrea, I tell you, we need them more. Things is high here. For example, these guys in Ladipo, they import from Cotonou mostly because of high duty at the port. So I think with those competition, even our locally produced things, they will wisen up, like Dangote and other things. They can reduce their prices. Looking at the security challenge, I think the military, they should be up and doing them, NAFDAC and other regulatory bodies. We need that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebuka, for calling. Ebuka, talking about standardization of products that are coming to Nigeria. Well, we've addressed that point earlier on, but he did talk about security as well. What do you think about that point he made about security?
Yeah, it makes a very good point, and you can't actually have a free trade agreement, without that. If the borders are not policed properly, then you might as well not have the agreement. And the reason is, the reason why Africa is coming together to do this is, like I said at the start, we're saying we want to give each other preferential access.
Right.
And just for us, because what's the objective here? We want intra-Africa trade to increase. That's the objective.
Right.
But if you're not policing your borders correctly, then anybody can just come and take advantage of that agreement. So it's no longer going to do that objective of doing intra-Africa trade if anyone can just come in. And the main tool that you used to stop that from happening is that term I mentioned called rules of origin, where you need to make sure that anything enjoying this preferential access is made in Africa. And you cannot do that without proper security at borders. And so everything we're talking about, free trade agreement, the benefits, the gains, it all crumbles if we are not policing our borders correctly. So he made a very good point there. The other good point he made as well,
go ahead,
was on the point of, I guess he mentioned how the domestic sector will start to buck up or behave themselves when competition comes out, and that's exactly what tends to happen when you open up your economy to in competition. On the whole, any business that is involved in international markets, exporting, through many studies, evidence is clear, they are a lot more productive than those that are not involved in international space.
Some will say that that's why we now no longer have quality rice, now that rice isn't coming into the country.
Yeah.
I've got, one final question about connectivity, because I've seen some people say that all of this free trade area talk is a moot point because Africa lacks connectivity. They say that as long as we don't have enough rail, roads, ports to link African countries, it doesn't matter whether or not there's a free trade agreement. What do you say?
Oh, yes, 100%. I mean, you can tell me I'm going to get, 0% tariff when I get to Ghana, but then if I'm trying to travel from here to Ghana by road and I'm facing that Badagry Express, I'm not going to do it. So it really falls down to that point about infrastructure and connectivity, even just flying. So when you're thinking about trade, we
very
always think about
expensive.
goods,
Mm-hmm.
but services as well. And services trade is basically human beings. So it's
Yeah.
basically someone saying, I want to go and offer my services in another country.
Mm-hmm.
But flying across Africa is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I was checking flights to go to Morocco, and from Nigeria, and I was seeing hundreds of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And from the UK to go to Morocco is less than £100.
Mm.
So that point about connectivity, both from rail, road, but also air, because if you're thinking about services, which is supposed to be the future of trade, then you have to really take into consideration how human beings are traveling, via air. And Africa is still very behind compared to other regions in terms of the connectivity between different countries.
Let me come back to the phone lines. 0700-993-993. Yes, WhatsApp also available. WhatsApp, please send a message. WhatsApp is 080-959-75825. And you can tweet at us if you want to. Twitter is at Nigeria Info FM. Use the hashtag Nigeria Info HF. HF stands for hard facts. So Nigeria Info HF, and that way we'll see your tweet very quickly. You can also send your post to Facebook. Facebook is Nigeria Info 99.3. David is in Ibeche Island. Hello, David. Thanks for calling.
Good evening, Sandra.
Good evening. Welcome.
Yeah. So I listened to your guests carefully.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Nigeria, as you rightly said, the competitive advantage, economic competitive advantage is zero. And so that's why I want to buy the idea of Nigeria not signing that African agreement. So we need to, first of all, because if, like your guest said, the weaker countries can just, bring in an industrialized nation to be using the economy of scale. We say a lot of people are not employed in Nigeria, and they will just be bringing their goods and nothing to keep our youth employed. So I want the government rather to first of all look, especially on the agricultural sector. Let's try to encourage the youth there and get a lot of them employed. A situation whereby we are importing cassava, we are importing maize. All these things are annoying. That's just my observation.
All right, David. Thanks for calling. We'll take one more call and then I'll come to Tokumbo about what he thinks about what David said. Hello. 99.3. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. What's your name?
Black from
Welcome. Go ahead.
To me, a country where people always like imported goods and foreign-made goods. People usually import common picking sticks. I don't buy the idea of Nigeria signing into that kind of deal. I don't buy the idea because we love importation in Nigeria.
We love what?
Importation in Nigeria.
Okay.
So I don't think that deal will favor Nigeria. Instead, it will even cause more harm for us.
Okay, it will cause more harm for us, he says. Let's wrap up, shall we? Tokumbo, what do you think about? Yeah, I have Fikayo a lot on the show, but what do you think? What do you think about the last two comments you got?
Yeah, I mean, David made a good point there about comparison. See, my example is we are paying for import to pay for it via exports. You can't. There's no other way to get the dollars for all the things we import. And so far, we've been paying for that with oil. It's a good 95% of our exports are oil. So, the thing to remember in this conversation is that Nigeria doesn't actually export anything apart from oil. And so, unfortunately, we don't produce anything, right? That is really going to give us something substantial from this deal. And so, we do need to start shifting in terms of our sectors and seeing where we can get, like David said, more production and more employment. We have comparative advantage. I've done the numbers. We have comparative advantage in stuff like cocoa, lead, leather, fertilizers, oil seeds, fruit and nuts, right? So I think, there's still some room to go in agriculture, but, let's not also forget the services side as well, which if you're thinking from a long-term view, that's a better place to start moving. So yes, very good point there.
Okay. All right. Tokumbo Afikuyomi is the editor-in-chief at Tears Business. Tokumbo, thank you so much for your time on Hard Facts today.
Thank you for having me. Take care, Sandra.
And Lagos, thank you for being a part of the conversation. It's been fantastic, if I do say so myself. If you missed it, you can catch up on our podcast, Hard Facts with Sandra Ezekwesili. Search for it on any of your streaming services. Anyone, Google, Apple, we're there. Listen again and pay attention to some of the details that you missed earlier on. If you also missed Madam Landlord today between 4 and 5, it's also available on our podcast, Hard Facts with Sandra Ezekwesili. We talked about how quick notices work. And on the big weekend, we discussed the Army's testimonial. We're going to go into detail about that tomorrow between 5 and 6. I'll have Inibehe Efyong on the show with me, who was at the panel on Saturday. So we'll take a look at the Army's testimony at the Lagos State Panel of Inquiry. We talked about food inflation as well. Catch all of that up on our podcast, Hard Facts with Sandra Ezekwesili. I am S. Ezekwesili on Twitter and Instagram, Sandra Ezekwesili on Facebook. Those were your Hard Facts, Lagos. See you tomorrow.
Talk, news, and sports after this.
My dear, that's what the popo just slide enter my DM fiam. Come they talk say, ain't go buy me Ferrari. Me.